The dawn breaks over the English Channel on June 6, 1944, painting the turbulent waters in shades of gray and steel. Thousands of vessels churn through the waves, carrying the hopes and fears of an entire generation. This is D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, and nowhere would the cost be higher than on a 6-mile stretch of French coastline that would come to be known simply as Omaha Beach. While history books capture the strategic importance of this moment, they often miss the deeply personal stories of the men who waded through those blood-stained waters. These are their untold stories, preserved through decades of silence, trauma, and eventual courage to speak. These are the voices of the survivors who lived through what General Omar Bradley nearly called off as a complete failure.
The night before, Private First Class Harold Baumgarten sits in the cramped hold of the HMS Empire Anvil, his hands trembling as he writes what he believes might be his final letter home. At 19 years old, the Jewish kid from the Bronx has already seen his share of hardship, but nothing has prepared him for what lies ahead. Around him, men engage in the timeless rituals of soldiers before battle. Some play cards with shaking hands, the slap of worn decks on wooden surfaces, providing a rhythmic counterpoint to the ship's engines. Others clean their weapons for the 100th time, the smell of gun oil mixing with sweat and fear. A few pray, their lips moving silently as they grip crucifixes, stars of David, or simply photographs of loved ones back home. Sergeant Ray Lambert, already a combat veteran from North Africa and Sicily, moves through the men with practiced ease, offering words of encouragement that mask his own deep anxiety. At 23, he's an old man by infantry standards, and his experience tells him something the fresh-faced replacements don't yet understand. The plan they've been briefed on, with its neat arrows and confident timelines, will dissolve the moment the first shell explodes. Lambert has learned that survival often comes down to luck and the smallest decisions made in moments of absolute chaos. He checks his medical supplies again, knowing that by this time tomorrow, he'll wish he had twice as much morphine and 10 times as many bandages. In another transport, Corporal Samuel Fuller, who would later become a renowned Hollywood director, scribbles notes in a small journal. Even now, his artistic eye captures details that others miss. The way shadows play across the faces of sleeping men. The nervous laughter that sounds almost like sobbing. The quiet resignation of those who've already accepted their fate. Fuller writes about Private Jenkins, barely 18, who keeps a worn copy of The Great Gatsby in his breast pocket, convinced that if he survives, he'll finish his education and become a writer. Fuller doesn't have the heart to tell him that the book probably won't stop a bullet. Nearby, Staff Sergeant John Robert Slaughter, a 20-year-old farm boy from Virginia, leads his squad in one final equipment check. Every man carries approximately 60 pounds of gear, equipment that will become deadly weight if they end up in deep water. The night drags on with agonizing slowness. Some men manage to sleep, their bodies stealing rest wherever possible, a skill learned through months of training. Others stare at the ceiling or out portholes at the vast armada surrounding them. Captain Robert Walker makes his rounds, projecting confidence he doesn't entirely feel. He's read the intelligence reports, seen the aerial photographs of Omaha Beach's defenses. The Germans have transformed the coastline into a killing ground, with interlocking fields of fire, minefields, obstacles designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, and concrete bunkers that will be nearly impossible to destroy. The pre-invasion bombardment is supposed to neutralize these defenses, but Walker has been in combat long enough to know that bombardments rarely work as planned. As midnight passes and the early hours of June 6th arrive, the weather adds another layer of uncertainty. The seas are rougher than planned, with waves reaching 4 to 6 feet. Many men are already seasick, vomiting into helmets and corners, their faces green even in the dim light. The decision to go had been General Eisenhower's alone, made just hours earlier after agonizing over weather reports. Another delay could mean waiting weeks for the right combination of tide and moonlight, and by then German intelligence might discover the invasion plans. The die is cast. There is no turning back now. In the darkness, engines rumble to life, and the vast machinery of war begins its inexorable movement toward the French coast.
The run to shore. At 0630 hours, the first wave of landing craft drops their ramps on Omaha Beach and hell erupts. The pre-invasion bombardment, meant to devastate German defenses, has largely failed. Most bombs and shells fell inland, leaving the beach fortifications intact and their defenders very much alive and alert. What the planners envisioned as a systematic advance immediately becomes a desperate fight for survival. Private Baumgarten's landing craft takes a direct hit before reaching shore. The explosion tears through steel and flesh with equal indifference. The man beside him, his friend, Private Robert Dittmar, takes shrapnel to the face and dies instantly. Baumgarten himself is wounded, but adrenaline and shock keep him moving. As the ramp drops, he plunges into water over his head, his equipment dragging him down toward the sandy bottom. The scene repeats across 2 miles of beach as landing craft after landing craft deposits men into what veterans will later describe as the closest thing to hell on earth. German machine gunners in concrete bunkers have carefully calibrated their fire lanes. They've had months to prepare, registering exact distances, creating interlocking fields that leave no safe approach. The distinctive sound of German MG-42 machine guns, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, tears through the air like ripping canvas. Tracer rounds create deadly geometric patterns against the gray dawn sky. Men fall by the dozens before even reaching dry sand. Some drown in 3 feet of water, weighted down by equipment and unable to rise after being hit. Others are cut down the moment the ramps drop, sometimes entire boatloads killed before taking a single step forward. Sergeant Ray Lambert's landing craft hits an underwater obstacle and the ramp drops into deep water. Men plunge in and immediately sink. Lambert, a strong swimmer, manages to surface but sees chaos everywhere. Bodies float face down in the surf. The water literally runs red with blood. Equipment, weapons, and personal effects litter the water and beach. Lambert spots a wounded soldier struggling in the surf and swims to him, dragging him toward shore while machine gun bullets snap overhead like angry hornets. He'll make this trip multiple times, pulling wounded men from the water even as he himself takes shrapnel wounds to the back and leg. The pain is distant, held at bay by adrenaline and the overwhelming need to help others. Years later, Lambert will barely remember these actions that will earn him multiple Silver Stars and other decorations. In the moment, there is only instinct and training taking over where conscious thought would paralyze. Corporal Fuller's boat lands further east, but the situation is no better. The beach before him is littered with obstacles that the engineers were supposed to clear but haven't been able to reach. Steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes topped with mines, and Belgian gates create a deadly maze. Bodies and pieces of bodies lie scattered across the sand. Fuller sees a man without legs trying to crawl forward, leaving a trail of blood. Another soldier sits perfectly upright against a seawall, looking peaceful except for the massive hole in his chest. The scenes burn into Fuller's memory, images that will later appear transformed in his war films. But now he runs. Everyone runs, sprints or crawls toward the seawall that offers the only cover on the entire beach. Men cluster there, pinned down, unable to advance and unable to retreat. Some are paralyzed with fear, others with wounds, many simply trying to process what they're experiencing. Private First Class Leo Haru lands in the first wave and watches his lieutenant, the first man off the ramp, get cut in half by machine gun fire. The lieutenant's body falls back into the landing craft, and for a moment, everyone freezes. Then training takes over, and men push forward, stepping over their dead officer into the water. Haru makes it to the beach and throws himself behind a knocked-out tank. He'll stay there for what feels like hours, but is probably 20 minutes, watching men die with such frequency that he becomes numb to it. He sees a medic running to help a wounded soldier get cut down mid-stride. He watches a friend from basic training take a direct hit from a mortar shell and simply disappear in a pink mist. The randomness of death becomes apparent. There's no pattern, no way to predict who will live and who will die. A man stands up to run and makes it 50 yards before being hit. Another stands up in the same spot moments later and is killed instantly. The tide brings in more waves of landing craft, adding fresh troops to the chaos, but also creating new problems. Boats can't find clear beaches and end up landing men in the wrong sectors, mixing units and destroying careful organizational plans. Some craft, seeing that carnage, hesitate,
or try to land men in slightly different spots, only to find those areas equally deadly. Coxswains, the Navy personnel piloting the landing craft, show extraordinary courage, making multiple runs into the beach despite losses. Many of these young sailors will be killed or wounded by the day is done, their sacrifice often overlooked in histories focused on the infantry. As the morning progresses, the beach becomes increasingly crowded with men, equipment, burning vehicles, and bodies. The scene is one of apparent total disaster. Officers trying to organize attacks are cut down, radio equipment is destroyed, command and control has completely broken down. On the ships offshore, commanders watching through binoculars seriously consider calling off the landing, pulling back, and trying elsewhere. Only the realization that withdrawal would be as deadly as staying prevents this decision.
The slaughter at Dog Green. Of all the sectors of Omaha Beach, none saw higher casualties than the stretch designated Dog Green. This is where Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment Virginia National Guard came ashore. These men, mostly from small towns in Virginia, had trained together for years. They knew each other like family, had been to each other's homes, knew each other's parents and siblings. In the span of about 15 minutes, Company A effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Out of 197 men, only around a dozen would survive the day unwounded. The rest would be killed, wounded, captured, or missing. It was one of the most catastrophic unit losses in American military history, and the stories of those who lived through it remain almost too painful to tell. Captain Taylor Fellers commanded Company A. He was a popular officer, respected by his men for his competence and concern for their welfare. As his landing craft approached the beach, Fellers could see that something was terribly wrong. The beach was supposed to be cratered from the bombardment, but it looked untouched. Worse, he could see tracer fire coming from positions that intelligence had assured them would be destroyed. There was no time to adjust. The ramp dropped, and Fellers led his men forward. He made it perhaps 10 steps before being cut down by machine gun fire. He died on the ramp, falling back into the arms of the men behind him. His death set the tone for what followed. Private First Class Gilbert Murdoch was in the same boat. He saw Captain Fellers fall and then saw half the men in the craft get hit before they even left the ramp. Murdoch jumped into water that came up to his chest. Machine gun fire stitched across the surface, and he felt men around him jerking and falling as bullets found them. He made it to a beach obstacle, a large wooden stake, and hid behind it. From there, he watched his company die. The Farrar brothers, twins from Bedford, Virginia, were cut down together. Sergeant John Wilkes, who had been so confident the night before, took a bullet through the throat and drowned in 18 inches of water. Lieutenant Edward Tidrick rallied a small group and tried to move forward, only to be killed by a mortar round that landed in the middle of his huddle of men. The Bedford Boys, as they came to be called, suffered particularly devastating losses. Bedford was a small town in Virginia, population around 3,000, and Company A drew heavily from its young men. When the Western Union telegrams started arriving in the weeks after D-Day, the entire town went into mourning. Families who had sent sons, brothers, and fathers to war together now grieved together. The town erected one of the first D-Day memorials in the country, a simple stone that listed name after name of local boys who never came home. Among them was Private First Class Raymond Hoback, whose Bible washed up on the beach weeks later and was returned to his family. His body was never found. His brother, Bedford Hoback, also landed on Omaha Beach, but with a different unit. He survived D-Day, only to be killed in combat months later. Sergeant Roy Stevens was one of the few Company A men to make it off the beach. He did so by playing dead for 2 hours, lying in the surf among corpses as the tide slowly came in. He could hear German soldiers on the bluff above calling to each other, sometimes shooting at bodies to make sure they were dead. Stevens held his breath every time boots came near. Finally, during a lull in the fire, he crawled forward, making it to the seawall where other survivors had gathered. He found only 7 other men from his company. 7 out of nearly 200. Stevens would never fully recover from the psychological wounds of that day. He carried survivor's guilt for the rest of his life, constantly asking himself why he lived when so many better men died. In interviews decades later, his voice would crack when talking about the friends he lost, about the boys from Bedford who deserved to come home more than he did.
The destruction of Company A had ripple effects that extended far beyond the battlefield. In the years after the war, Bedford struggled with its losses. The town's demographics were permanently altered. Young women who had expected to marry local boys found themselves without prospects. Parents who had lost their only sons had no one to carry on family businesses or farms. The psychological trauma spread through the community like a contagion. Surviving veterans returned home and found themselves unable to talk about their experiences, even to other survivors. They self-medicated with alcohol, suffered nightmares and flashbacks, destroyed marriages and careers. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be recognized as a diagnosis for decades, so these men suffered without understanding what was wrong with them or how to get help. Bedford became a town haunted by ghosts, by the absence of a generation of young men who should have lived full lives.
Heroes in Hell. Amidst the slaughter and chaos, acts of extraordinary heroism emerged. These weren't the planned, coordinated attacks envisioned by commanders. They were individual and small group actions, often spontaneous decisions made in moments of desperation. Men who had every excuse to hide, to give up, to surrender, instead found reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. Their actions, multiplied across the beach, eventually broke the deadlock and turned what looked like certain defeat into victory. But victory came at a terrible price, and many heroes didn't live to receive recognition. Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, landed on Omaha Beach around 0730 hours. At 41, he was old for combat and could have easily stayed on a command ship. Instead, he came ashore with the infantry. What he found appalled him. Men were huddled behind the seawall, leaderless and paralyzed. Officers were dead or missing. Unit cohesion had collapsed. Cota immediately began moving along the beach, rallying men, organizing small groups, and personally leading attacks. His most famous moment came when he encountered a group of Rangers who were pinned down. "Rangers, lead the way!" he shouted, a phrase that would become the Ranger motto. Cota led them through a minefield and up the bluff, destroying German positions with grenades and small arms fire. He seemed immune to fear, walking upright when others crawled, exposing himself to fire constantly. Miraculously, he survived the day with only minor wounds. Colonel George Taylor, commander of the 16th Infantry Regiment, arrived on Easy Red Sector to find a similar situation. Men were pinned down, taking casualties from artillery and mortar fire even behind cover. Taylor realized that staying on the beach was more dangerous than attacking. He issued one of the most famous orders of D-Day. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here!" He began organizing scratch teams to attack the draws and bluffs, mixing men from different units, giving them simple objectives, and pointing them forward. Taylor was wounded twice during the day, but refused evacuation. His leadership was crucial in turning the tide on his sector of the beach. Medics performed miracles under impossible conditions. They were prohibited by Geneva Convention from carrying weapons, marking them with red crosses that were supposed to protect them but often seemed to make them targets. German soldiers, following orders to eliminate leadership and support personnel, frequently shot medics. Despite this, men like Private First Class Charles Shea ran back and forth across the beach, pulling wounded men from the water, administering morphine, applying bandages, and offering comfort to the dying. Shea, a Penobscot Indian from Maine, would make multiple trips into the surf to rescue drowning men. He'd drag them to cover, render first aid, then go back for more. At one point, he worked on a soldier for 15 minutes, trying to save a life, only to have a mortar round land nearby and kill the man he was treating. Shea simply moved to the next wounded soldier and continued working. Engineers deserve special recognition for their heroism. They were tasked with clearing beach obstacles under fire. Dangerous work even in peacetime. Demolition teams were supposed to blow 16-foot-wide gaps through the obstacles at regular intervals. They landed with the first waves and immediately took catastrophic casualties. Many teams were destroyed before they could even set their charges. Those who survived worked under constant fire, placing explosives on obstacles while machine guns and mortars tried to kill them.
Some obstacles had mines attached, making the work even more dangerous. Several engineers were killed by their own explosives when German fire detonated charges prematurely. Despite losses of over 40%, the engineers managed to clear several gaps, allowing follow-up waves better access to the beach. Private First Class Carlton Barrett landed as part of a combat engineer team. Their boat took a direct hit from an 88mm shell just before reaching the beach, killing half the men aboard and destroying most of their equipment. Barrett, wounded and dazed, still managed to swim ashore with a satchel of explosives. He found another engineer, also the sole survivor of his team, and together they worked their way along the beach clearing obstacles. When they ran out of explosives, they collected charges from dead engineers and continued working. Barrett was wounded 3 more times that day but refused evacuation. By nightfall, he had personally cleared dozens of obstacles, work that saved countless lives as more waves came in. He would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, but like many veterans, he rarely spoke of his actions, feeling that he'd simply done his job. Sailors and Coast Guard personnel showed equal courage. Lieutenant Walter Sidlowski commanded an LCM, landing craft mechanized, that made 11 trips to Omaha Beach on D-Day. Each trip meant navigating through obstacles and artillery fire to reach the beach, drop off men or supplies, then back out through the same gauntlet. His craft was hit multiple times, and several crew members were wounded, but Sidlowski kept going. On one trip, his craft hit a mine that blew a hole in the bow. Sidlowski ordered his crew to flood the engine compartment to keep the craft level, then drove it at full speed onto the beach so it could unload before sinking. He and his crew then salvaged what they could and helped fight his infantry until the beach was secured. Acts like this, repeated by dozens of small craft commanders, kept men and supplies flowing to the beach even during the worst of the fighting.
The tide turns. By mid-morning, the situation on Omaha Beach remained desperate, but was beginning to shift. The breakthrough came not from a single decisive action, but from dozens of small groups finding ways off the beach. Naval destroyers, frustrated by their inability to help from offshore, made the dangerous decision to come in close to the beach, some grounding themselves in shallow water. From there, they could bring their 5-inch guns to bear on German positions, firing at nearly point-blank range. The accurate naval gunfire began to suppress German defenses, giving infantry the breathing room they needed to organize attacks. USS McCook, USS Carmack, and USS Frankfurt were among the destroyers that closed to within 1,000 yards of shore, deliberately making themselves targets to help the soldiers on the beach. Small groups of infantry, led by sergeants and junior officers, found weak points in the German defenses. The draws, the natural valleys that cut through the bluffs, were heavily defended and impassable. But some men discovered that the steep bluffs themselves could be climbed in places. Using Bangalore torpedoes to clear barbed wire, rifle grenades to suppress machine gun nests, and pure determination to overcome exhaustion and fear, teams began working their way up the bluffs. Each successful climb established a toehold that others could exploit. Staff Sergeant William Presley led a group up a particularly steep section, climbing hand over hand while Germans shot down at them and rolled grenades over the edge. 3 men were killed during the climb, but the rest made it to the top and established a fighting position that allowed others to follow. The Rangers who had landed at Pointe du Hoc, despite their own desperate fight against German positions there, began to send patrols inland. These Rangers, accustomed to operating independently, disrupted German communications and prevented reinforcements from reaching the beach. Their actions, combined with the confusion caused by Allied airborne drops inland, kept German commanders uncertain about where to commit their reserves. This uncertainty was crucial. If the Germans had been able to mass their forces and counterattack while American troops were still disorganized on the beach, they might have driven the invasion back into the sea. Instead, German units fought isolated battles, allowing Americans to establish positions before facing coordinated counterattacks. By early afternoon, American forces had secured several exits from the beach and were beginning to push inland. The accumulation of men and material on the beach, which had seemed like a disaster in the morning, now provided the critical mass needed for offensive operations. Engineers had cleared enough obstacles to allow landing craft easier access. Medical personnel had established aid stations and were evacuating the worst wounded to ships offshore. Quartermasters were organizing supply dumps. The beach was still under occasional artillery fire, and snipers remained active, but the immediate threat of being pushed back into the sea had passed. Commanders began to think about objectives beyond simple survival. Lieutenant John Spaulding led one of the most successful attacks of the day. With a composite group of about 30 men from various units, he worked around the heavily defended E1 draw and found a weakly held position on the bluff. After a sharp firefight, his group cleared several German positions and established a secure route off the beach. Spaulding then organized his men into defensive positions and sent runners back to the beach to guide other units up. His actions created one of the first reliable exits from the beach, and hundreds of men used his route to get inland. Spaulding would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, and remarkably, despite being in combat throughout D-Day and subsequent campaigns, he survived the war and lived to be 91 years old, one of the last surviving officers who landed in the first wave. As evening approached, American forces had pushed about a mile inland in some areas, though the beachhead remained dangerously shallow. German forces still held key positions that should have been taken by noon according to the plan. Casualties had been catastrophic. Over 2,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing on Omaha Beach alone, making it by far the bloodiest of the 5 D-Day beaches. But the beachhead held. Ships continued to unload men, vehicles, and supplies. Engineers worked through the night to improve the beach exits and clear mines. Medical personnel continued to work on the wounded, performing surgery in makeshift aid stations under canvas tents. The crisis had passed, but everyone knew that German counterattacks would come in the morning. The night would be spent preparing for what came next, digging foxholes, establishing defensive positions, and bringing up artillery and anti-tank guns.
The night after. As darkness fell on June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach transformed into a surreal landscape of fire and shadow. Burning vehicles cast flickering light across the sand. German artillery continued to shell the beach intermittently, causing the occasional crump of explosions and spray of sand and shrapnel. Men who had survived the day now faced the additional challenge of surviving the night. Many were in shock, both psychological and physical. They'd witnessed horrors that their minds couldn't yet process. Friends had died beside them. They'd killed men, sometimes at close range, seeing the faces of the enemy as they fell. Now, in the darkness, imagination turned every sound into a threat, every shadow into an enemy soldier. Private Harold Baumgarten, wounded multiple times during the landing, found himself in an aid station that was little more than a tent set up behind the seawall. Medics worked by lantern light, triaging the wounded, trying to stabilize the worst cases for evacuation. The sound of men crying out in pain, calling for their mothers, begging for water, created a constant background noise. Baumgarten, despite his own wounds, helped the medics as best he could, holding plasma bottles, comforting dying men, covering the faces of those who didn't make it. Years later, he would write about this night as being worse in some ways than the landing itself. During the chaos of battle, adrenaline had carried him through.
Now, in the relative quiet, he had time to think about what he'd seen, about his dead friends, about how close he'd come to dying himself. Sergeant Ray Lambert refused evacuation despite his wounds. He moved through the darkness, checking on the men he'd saved during the day, making sure they'd made it to aid stations or been evacuated. He found several soldiers who had crawled into the seawall and hidden there, too traumatized to move. Lambert coaxed them out, got them to medics, made sure they received help. Some of these men were unwounded physically, but completely broken mentally. Their eyes had a distant, empty look that Lambert recognized from previous campaigns. These men would require a different kind of healing, one that wouldn't come from bandages and morphine. Lambert himself was running on empty, powered only by duty and the need to help others. When he finally allowed himself to be evacuated to a ship just after midnight, he collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion. Corporal Samuel Fuller spent the night with a small group of soldiers in a shell crater about 500 yards inland. They took turns on watch, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, though few actually slept during their off hours. Every rustle in the darkness could be German infiltrators. Allied forces hadn't yet established clear lines, so German and American positions were often intermixed. Passwords and countersigns were crucial, but in the confusion, many units didn't know the current codes. Several soldiers were killed by friendly fire during the night, shot by nervous sentries who heard movement and fired first. Fuller's group huddled together for warmth as much as security. The June night was surprisingly cold, and many men had lost their equipment, including blankets and shelter halves, during the landing. German forces were also exhausted and disorganized. The defenders of Omaha Beach had fought magnificently, inflicting casualties far beyond what Allied planners had expected. But they'd also taken losses, used up most of their ammunition, and lost communication with higher headquarters. Some positions remained intact and dangerous, but many German soldiers were ready to surrender if given the chance. Others, particularly SS troops and fanatics loyal to Hitler, intended to fight to the death. This created a patchwork of resistance. One fortification might surrender without a fight, while the next would resist fiercely. Allied forces had to approach every position as if it were fully manned and determined to fight, leading to slow, cautious advances that lasted through the night. Supply personnel worked through the darkness to organize the beach. Mountains of equipment had been landed throughout the day, much of it dumped hastily wherever boats could reach. Now quartermasters tried to sort ammunition from rations, medical supplies from engineering equipment, creating order from chaos. They worked under blackout conditions, unable to use lights for fear of drawing artillery fire. Voices were kept to whispers. Everything was done by feel and memory. Trucks and bulldozers that had made it ashore were organized into convoys to carry supplies to the units now dug in on the bluffs and beyond. Drivers navigated in near total darkness on roads that were often little more than tracks through minefields, guided by white tape laid down by engineers. The wounded who couldn't be evacuated immediately lay on stretchers in collection points, waiting for transport to the ships. Chaplains moved among them, offering prayer and comfort regardless of denomination. Father Joseph Lacey, a Catholic priest, gave last rites to Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic soldiers alike, knowing that in death, all faiths converged on the same fundamental need for peace. Many wounded men asked the chaplains to write letters to their families, wanting to send final words in case they didn't survive the trip to the hospital ships. These letters, scribbled by flashlight on whatever paper was available, would arrive in American homes weeks later, precious communications from the threshold between life and death. Some men survived, and their families received both the letter and, eventually, the man himself. Others died during evacuation, and their letters became final testimonies, last words from sons and husbands who would never come home.
The psychological scars. The physical wounds suffered on Omaha Beach healed with time, but the psychological trauma proved more enduring. Veterans of the landing would carry invisible scars for the rest of their lives. Many developed what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1944 it was called battle fatigue or shell shock if it was recognized at all. The common belief was that real men could handle combat without breaking down, that psychological wounds indicated weakness or cowardice. This cultural attitude meant that many D-Day veterans suffered in silence for decades, unable to seek help and unwilling to discuss their experiences, even with family. Staff Sergeant John Robert Slaughter, who survived the landing and went on to fight through France and Germany, found himself plagued by nightmares for years after the war. He'd dream of being back on the beach, watching his friends die over and over again. He'd wake up screaming, covered in sweat, his wife frightened and confused by his terror. During the day, sudden loud noises would send him diving for cover. The smell of certain foods cooking would remind him of burning flesh and make him nauseous. 4th of July fireworks were unbearable, the explosions too reminiscent of artillery fire. Slaughter tried to drink away the memories, a common coping mechanism that destroyed many veterans' lives. He'd go through periods of deep depression, unable to hold a job or function normally. It took decades, and eventually the recognition of PTSD as a legitimate condition, before Slaughter could begin to heal. Many veterans found themselves unable to form close relationships. They'd lost so many friends so suddenly that they became afraid to care deeply about anyone. Wives and children found themselves shut out, unable to penetrate the emotional walls these men built. Some marriages survived, with patient partners slowly helping their veteran husbands work through trauma. Many marriages didn't survive. Divorce rates among D-Day veterans were significantly higher than the general population. Children of these veterans often grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally absent, men who'd seen and done things they could never discuss, carrying burdens that warped their ability to show normal affection. Survivor's guilt particularly haunted those who made it through relatively unscathed. Men who'd watched their friends die wondered why they'd been spared, what made them worthy of survival when better men perished. This question gnawed at them, creating a deep sense of unworthiness. Some veterans engaged in self-destructive behavior, unconsciously punishing themselves for living. Others threw themselves into work or causes, trying to live lives worthy of those who died, attempting to justify their survival through achievement. Few found peace easily. Roy Stevens, the Company A survivor who played dead in the surf, attempted suicide multiple times in the years after the war. He felt that his friends' deaths had meaning because they contributed to winning the war, but his survival was random chance, unearned and undeserved. The military was ill-equipped to deal with these psychological casualties. Psychiatric care in the 1940s was primitive by modern standards. Veterans who sought help were often dismissed, or worse, stigmatized as weak or crazy. Many were given simple advice to tough it out or move on, as if trauma could be overcome through willpower alone. Some veterans were institutionalized, locked away in VA hospitals where they received little effective treatment. Others were prescribed medications that turned them into zombies without actually addressing the underlying issues. The combination of inadequate treatment and social stigma meant that many D-Day veterans suffered alone, feeling isolated even when surrounded by people who loved them. It wasn't until Vietnam veterans began openly discussing their own trauma that the cultural conversation shifted. Organizations of combat veterans formed, providing peer support and advocacy for better treatment. D-Day survivors, now middle-aged or elderly, finally found forums where they could discuss their experiences with people who understood. Veterans groups organized trips back to Normandy where survivors could walk the beaches again, this time in peace. These pilgrimages proved surprisingly therapeutic for many men. Confronting the physical place where trauma occurred, seeing it transformed from a killing ground to a peaceful beach with playing children, helped some veterans integrate their experiences. The act of sharing stories with fellow survivors, often for the first time, relieved decades of pent-up emotion.
The search for meaning. As years passed, D-Day veterans struggled with fundamental questions of meaning. Had the sacrifice been worth it? Did their suffering serve a greater purpose? These questions took on different dimensions as the world evolved. The Cold War replaced the clear moral certainty of World War II with ambiguous conflicts. Later wars in Korea and Vietnam seemed less justified, less successful. causing some D-Day veterans to question whether their generation's sacrifice had led to lasting peace or merely a temporary pause in humanity's cycle of violence. The fall of France to terrorism and social upheaval in later decades caused some to wonder if they'd saved a civilization that no longer valued what they'd fought for. For Jewish veterans like Harold Baumgarten, D-Day took on additional significance when the full horror of the Holocaust became known. Baumgarten had fought in part because he was Jewish and understood the threat Hitler posed to his people. After the war, when evidence of concentration camps and mass extermination emerged, he felt vindicated in some way. His suffering on Omaha Beach had contributed to stopping genocide, to saving Jewish lives. This gave meaning to his trauma and the deaths of his friends. When Baumgarten finally began speaking publicly about his D-Day experiences in the 1990s, he always connected them to the Holocaust, explaining why the fight had been necessary, why the cost had been acceptable.